Since ancient times, there have been holidays to mark the arrival of the spring season. In the United Kingdom, this holiday tradition takes the form of the May Day celebration, a celebration that had certain associations with fertility and pagan implications that led to its banning by Puritan authorities, and as such it never really became a celebrated holiday in the United States. In the United Kingdom and parts of Europe, the holiday never quite faded away and even came to be celebrated as a workers' holiday, much like Labor Day in the US. The neo-pagan movement and folklore revivals of the 20th century have even led to a resurgence of what is considered traditional May Day and Beltane celebrations. The festivities can take multiple forms, but often include bonfires, dancing around maypoles, and processions through streets festooned with flowers and greenery. These processions tend to include rather colorful characters, such as the Jack in the Green, who can appear as a somewhat otherworldly fellow, painted all green and literally in the green, as he walks about in a sort of conical assemblage, heavily laden with thick green foliage, like some sort of walking topiary. It's also quite common to have a May King and or a May Queen, who may or may not be attendants of the Jack in the Green. There are any number of different interpretations about what these figures represent, but an association that they have had, going back to at least the late Middle Ages, is with none other than Robin Hood and Maid Marian. Figures linked to romance, popular celebration, and of course, the Greenwood. All of the festooning with flowers and greenery mentioned earlier is often referred to as bringing in the May. It's been mentioned before on this podcast that scholars tend to cite these May Day celebrations as how Maid Marian, a figure who likely originated from earlier French pastoral literature, came to be associated with Robin Hood, a May Queen to Robin's May King. Incidentally, it may well also be how Friar Tuck enters the tales, since a jolly plump friar was the sort of stock comedic character who would also frequently be featured in May Day processions. I could easily devote an entire episode to the history, meanings, and variations that surround May Day, and hopefully I will at some point. But at the moment, this all came to mind in the context of the Theresa Tomlinson books known as the Forest Wife trilogy. In 1993, Theresa Tomlinson published her Marian-centric retelling of the Robin Hood tale as The Forest Wife. She followed it with two sequels, Child of the May, published in 1998, and The Path of the She-Wolf in 2000. In 2022, all three books became available again in a single volume that she has self-published through Amazon. In these books, there is a theme regarding the passing of time, and it is especially marked via her depictions of the annual May Day celebrations her characters partake in. An especially apt choice, given the associations mentioned above. There is a lot to enjoy and admire about these books, and they do genuinely feel different from any other Robin Hood tale I've read before, including the ones that primarily focus on Marian. The story includes a Marian who becomes as legendary a figure as Robin Hood, but not as a sort of female distaff. She does likewise live outside the law, but operates in a wholly different manner, and there are many who come to either revere or dread the infamous Witch of Barnesdale, also known as the Forest Wife. Now, string your bow, pack up your medicinal herbs, and prepare to bring in the May as we enter the Greenwood with author Theresa Tomlinson.
How is everything? You still live in Yorkshire, right?
Yes, I live in Whitby now. When I was writing the stories, I lived in Sheffield, and that was really quite important to me because Sheffield has always claimed Robin Hood to some degree. And there's always been a little bit of a battle between Nottingham and Sheffield. But because Robin of Locksley, we have got Locksley at Sheffield, and there's sort of quite old Robin Hood stories linked to Sheffield. So it was a lot of fun, really, to be living there. Where we lived, our local pub was called the Robin Hood, and it was an old pub. And sort of doing a bit of research, I found that initially it had been called the Robin Hood and Little John, and then the name had been changed. And I don't know why that was, but of course Sheffield is also close to Hathersage, where we have Little John's grave. So there are lots and lots of links.
Yeah, I wanted to thank you for getting into that. That was something I was hoping to bring up. It's one of those things that is very well known in that area, and I've even heard people from Nottingham bring this up in terms of the like, oh well, is Robin Hood from Nottingham, Sherwood, or is he from Yorkshire? And how there's this little bit of contention. But here in the U.S., like, he's from Nottingham and Sherwood, and like the idea of Barnesdale and the idea of Yorkshire, where Locksley would have been. Hathersage gets brought up every now and then in the books, but not very often in like the mass media with movies or anything. So I'm very delighted to get somebody who's got that perspective coming from Sheffield. And I feel a little bit guilty now because when I was in the UK last summer, I made a point of visiting Nottingham and Sherwood Forest, and I had some friends who were living in Sheffield come and meet us in Nottingham. I should have made a point of also going to visit them in their home.
Maybe there'll be another chance.
Yeah, I think there definitely will be. That will have to happen. While we're just on that topic of these various places that have these Robin Hood associations and that you have associations with, I read in the interview you gave to Allen Wright of the Bold Outlaw website, and I'll certainly link that interview in the show description. You mentioned visiting Robin Hood's Bay.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could share that story for our listeners, because that is a very old story pertaining to Robin Hood, but not one of the very well-known ones. It doesn't get repeated a lot. I don't think it's ever been converted into television or film.
No, I'm not aware of that either. But I mean, I now live in Whitby, very close to Robin Hood's Bay. And I actually lived in this area as a child. So visiting Robin Hood's Bay as a child was quite a regular thing. It was a big day out. It was something that we loved to do. And I seem to remember from a very early age, my granddad telling me the story of why is it called Robin Hood's Bay? And he said, I mean, I think there's various versions, but he said that there was a man called Simon Wise who came to Robin Hood's Bay, and he was a great archer, and he helped some of the fishermen. So he used to start to go fishing with the fishermen, go out in boats. And one day they were confronted with a pirate ship. And the pirates were threatening to come aboard. But Simon Wise stood on the deck with his bow and arrow, and he shot every pirate that came towards them, and saved the fishermen from the pirates. Also, that then they found that the pirate ship was full of gold, which Simon Wise said must be given to the poor fisher folk up the coast. And then he headed off towards Sherwood Forest and became Robin Hood. Now, I've heard another version that is just that high cliffs along the coast there, and that pirates did come round that area, and that the fishermen, the locals, defended the towns from the cliff tops with bows and arrows. So that's another possibility that they became known as sort of Robin Hood's men. What the truth about that all is, like many legends and myths, I'm not sure.
That is one of the things that I really love about that particular story. One is that it has the element where you're taking Robin Hood out of the familiar setting and showing sort of how he would function in sort of the way that we expect him to function, but without being in the forest, but in that different context of being on the water there. But also the folkloric element about how it's being used to describe the name of a location and how it connects to the history of the people and the practices that they did there. It's a story that I think is really a wonderful part of the Robin Hood legend, and it's a little sad to me that it's often gets overlooked. And it was one of my favorite chapters in your books as well. And we should probably get into those, what your books are and who you are. Let's kind of maybe backtrack a little bit. If you'd just like to give a basic introduction for the listeners.
Yes, okay. I mean, I'm now in my 70s, so looking back to childhood, I lived in this Whitby area, a little bit north of Whitby. And so television was just coming on when I was growing up. And in our house, we didn't have a television for many years, but our grandparents did. So we really looked forward. It was a huge treat to go to Grandma and Granddad's. And one of our favourite programmes there was, I think it was Richard Green, Robin Hood series. And we absolutely loved that. And so from a very early age, I've been interested in Robin Hood. I mean, we also lived in a village where there were lots of sort of fields around us, and we were very free to roam. And along with my brother, I can remember sort of going and making bows and arrows, just with bits of string and breaking twigs off. But we seemed to manage to make something that would actually shoot. It wouldn't go very far, but but it was very satisfying that you could actually make a bow and arrow with a bit of string and a bit of wood and make a little notch, and you could actually send it shooting across fields. So that was fun. Then I guess we moved around a bit, and I ended up living in Sheffield with my husband, and that's where we had children. And so, I mean, I kind of forgot a bit about Robin Hood, but then when my youngest son was quite small, about 6 or 7, Prince of Thieves film came out. And so, of course, we went to see it. My youngest son became absolutely obsessed with the film. And we had a copy of it, a video of it, I think it would be then. And he played it over and over again. And he absolutely loved it, and he knew it off by heart. So that, I mean, I particularly remember the meeting and the fight by the stream between Little John and Robin Hood. He would say it all with them, he knew all the lines. And so that was all a lot of fun and kind of got me interested again. And I did like the film, and there were certain things about the film that particularly interested me, and that actually Marian was a good character, I think. She was still a bit of a lady, but she was quite strong and vigorous. That was good. But what I liked most of all was the image of other women and families in the woods. Little John's wife, and they had lots of children. And there was the bit where she ended up having the Moor was able to give her a cesarean. And I thought that was fantastic, but actually probably historically possible. given that it was the time of the Crusades,
Sure.
and the Moors at that time were very sophisticated and advanced. And I thought that was all very interesting. Then Robin of Sherwood series came with Michael Praed, and I absolutely loved that. And again, we watched it avidly. And I think again, Marian, I thought was a good character. She was still a bit of a lady, wasn't she? But she mucked in well with the men in the forest, and she learned to shoot. She was pretty capable, and so I really enjoyed that aspect of it. The other side of it that I liked was the mystical nature that kept coming in with Herne the Hunter. And I thought, oh, I really enjoyed that aspect of it. And because I'd been writing for sort of some young children and some older children, I just started to get the idea that maybe it would be possible to take those kind of Marian ideas a step further, so that it wasn't just that Marian was there in the woods and the women were there in the woods, but that actually they became the main focus of the story.
Yeah, that's certainly one of the things that I most appreciated about the book is, there's lots of retellings, of course, out there. Sorry, there's a train going by outside. No way to keep some of that from getting onto the recording. So there's so many adaptations of Robin Hood out there, and in a lot of them, Marian might be much more of the noble lady figure, and some of them, like the series with Michael Praed, she ends up going into the forest. You certainly see that in like the the Robin McKinley books. But your book did the thing where instead of just having Marian and perhaps some other female characters who are present, participating in some of the male stories that are going on, you made it be about their stories and their experience. And Robin Hood and Little John and some of the other more familiar merry men are present, but they're the supporting cast for Marian and her friends. The real focus is on the lives of these women. And I remember reading your books and describing them to my partner in terms of how in a lot of the Robin Hood stories, there's a power fantasy that occurs where it's about being able to take charge of your destiny and going out and being self-sufficient in the woods. But a lot of it ultimately comes down to then you're able to get revenge for the wrongs that were done against you. And, and it becomes very action movie sort of centric, even in some of the novels. And your book felt like such an inverse to that, where it still had this fantasy element, but not like the power fantasy, but the fantasy of these women who are able to live very strong, independent lives and be able to be supportive of one another. They've got this network of friends and lovers and others, so they're not just isolated, but it wasn't about seeking revenge. It was about helping one another and being self-sufficient.
Yeah, I thought, I felt as though I wanted it to be about survival, really, and to try to sort of look at the history of the time. I mean, I decided to set it at the time of Richard the Lionheart and then eventually John, because I think that was really just because I thought that would be easier for most people reading a story like this, not to feel that it was too strange compared to other Robin Hood stories. So I felt as though I was doing something different enough without putting it in a different time period. And so then I wanted to try to find out sort of more about what life would really have been like for women very ordinary women, peasant women, people who were women who were struggling at that time, to some extent in a historical sense. And how could you survive in those difficult situations?
Yeah. You mentioned in your previous interview the book Women in Medieval Life by Margaret Wade Labarge. I've not had an opportunity to read that myself, but it sounded really interesting, and I wanted to make sure that that got referenced too, especially as you mentioned that there was a chapter in that book called Women on the Fringe that even talked about the lives of women in the Middle Ages, including those that would be outcasts or outlaws.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, that book was really important to me. At one point, I almost gave up on my project when I sort of tried to look back further and further at the Robin Hood legends and found there was no Marian there. And thought, oh, oh dear, is this going to work really, and sort of got a little bit stuck. But then that book got me going again, because I thought, no, okay, I can't find a mythological, legendary Marian that goes really a long way back in time. But there are lots of other women in that period who were real women who were doing all sorts of interesting things. And the thing about the nuns too, I thought I sort of got quite hooked on that, because I found that was the time when there was a papal bull which was saying that nuns should be much more confined to their convents and shouldn't go wandering about, meeting other people, talking, doing things which actually might have been very helpful to the people around them. And so that also gave me the idea about the nuns, the forest nuns.
Yes, and if you want to find out what happens to the forest nuns, you can just read the book yourself. The point about Marian was something that I wanted to touch on, the idea how she wasn't there very early in the Robin Hood legends and came in a little bit later. And the sort of commonly accepted wisdom is that she was sort of brought into the Robin Hood stories and plays, sort of folded in via the May Day games.
Yes.
And that is a wonderful touch that you have in your book, in that this book that is very centric on Marian also really utilizes the May Day games and festivities. It's very emblematic of the sort of theme of the cyclicalness of life, in that you have the May Day games recurring at various points, and it becomes significant over who's playing various roles in them. And so having a Marian-focused story that also utilizes the May Day games felt very appropriate in that regard.
Good.
So I was wondering what sort of inspired you to lean so much into the use of those May Day games, and what aspects of them you really wanted to emphasize.
Yes. I think it's to do with my ideas about pagan religion and Christianity. Probably, although there was a lot of Christianity at that time with the nuns and the bishops, and it was very well established, I actually felt that for the ordinary people, the old pagan beliefs would still be very important, because for them, it's all about the land, agriculture, growing food, gathering food. And so the turn of the year, I thought, would still be incredibly important at that time for these people who are actually really at the bottom and struggling. Having a good harvest would be so important. But also, and so I wanted to focus on the turn of the year and the different seasons and all the different activities that were important. I mean, my Marian is always saying, go out and gather, go and gather nuts, go and gather berries, go. So I felt that links up with the May Day games and the sense that you have to respect nature if you're going to use it. I mean, the thing about killing the deer too, I felt as though I didn't want to shy away from what it would mean to be killing deer, especially if you actually weren't supposed to. And I mean, your whole life could hang on being caught. I mean, the whole aspect of sort of how you did it, but hunger would drive people to do this and to take these risks. But then I thought it was important that the other aspect of it was that they danced for the deer as part of the celebrations, that somebody had to get dressed up with deer horns and play the part of the deer. And it was part of a sort of way of trying to respect nature and that they were needing to use. I mean, there's the bit too that I enjoyed doing about the Panage month.
Yeah.
The tradition was for the pigs to go into the forest, to be herded into the forest, to eat all the acorns in I think it's October. And so I won't say what happens, but it was quite fun to find that there's a forest full of pigs that could come into the story in some way.
I really enjoyed that chapter in particular because it involved that kind of creative use of this, real world thing that was done, the panage, the driving the pigs into the forests so that they can get fat on the acorns and then driving them back out so they can be slaughtered or kept for the winter, and that sort of running of the pigs. I've now come across a Robin Hood story that involves that aspect, even though everything's centered around the forest so much. But then you also incorporated it into one of the older stories, where they're saving, I think it's Will Stuteley in your version, which is the original ballad, The Saving of Will Stuteley. So not to, again, give too much away, but you're sort of, in a way that I have not seen before, both incorporating an earlier legend with a historical practice in a surprising way. It certainly made it a much different version of that classic tale than I've come across before.
Yes, I didn't want to stray too far from the traditional Robin Hood. And so I like to see, whenever I could, to bring in aspects of the old stories. I mean, another theme that I just love is disguise. That seems to be there in the older Robin Hood stories. And the story of Robin Hood dressing up as the potter, stealing the potter's clothes and going into Nottingham and sitting there right in front of the sheriff's castle, in front of the castle, disguised as a potter. So I really enjoyed bringing those kind of more traditional bits into the story too.
Yeah, I think another one of my favorite chapters goes back to what we were discussing earlier with Robin Hood's Bay, where I don't think there were any French pirates involved, but it was a very, very personal moment in the story between Robin and Marian.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, I wanted to create a bit of tension. I didn't want them to just sort of meet each other and fall in love. So at first, they actually don't get on too well in my version. And there's quite a lot of tension between the two of them. And so, but that's the bit of the story when it sort of starts to change.
Yeah, they spend some time together, and it was
Yeah.
interesting also because it, like I was saying earlier, one of the things I like about the classic tale is that it takes them out of the normal context. You know, they have this moment of bonding and getting to know one another better, but it's not happening under the oaks of Sherwood or Barnesdale for that matter. It's happening by the seaside.
Yeah.
And I felt that helped it focus more on the characters and the story that you were telling with them, as opposed to just falling into the normal trappings that we expect.
Yeah. I looking back at the Jest of Robin Hood, I wanted my version of Robin to be a bit different if I could, but actually looking back to that, I found that very interesting, that I found there not the classical Robin Hood character that we know, but a much more kind of moody personality.
Oh yeah.
Quite almost depressive at times. And so I found that very interesting. Oh, another thing that helped me from the time that I was writing was that it was round about the time when Bob Geldof was doing the Feed the World concerts. And they quite sort of a lot of pop stars were getting together, and I thought the character of Bob Geldof was interesting, that he seemed to be quite a sort of moody, awkward, a sort of slightly scruffy kind of image, but that in this particular aspect of his life, he was hugely moved with compassion. And I thought that's a bit what I wanted to use for my version of Robin.
Yeah. That's a really interesting perspective, and one that I like. And certainly we touched a little bit on the Marian, who in many versions has a very noble aspect, and in yours she starts out as the daughter of a nobleman, but then kind of departs that lifestyle right at the very beginning, and then never seeks it again. We never really get her contextualized in that princess sort of way. And your Robin also comes from very humble origins. This is not the heir to Locksley. This is not the dispossessed baron.
No, that's right. I listened to your podcast with Stephen Mackay, and I found that very interesting, because although I know he set it at a different time, I felt there were certain similarities, that he'd set Robin in Barnesdale in the more Yorkshire version of Robin Hood. And I understood why he wanted to do that. And I like that idea. And that's something similar that I wanted to do. I wanted it to be a down-to-earth Yorkshire story. Yeah. I mean, it does stray into Sherwood and Nottingham, but I mean, actually, those places aren't far apart. Right. You could go from Barnesdale and you wouldn't know when you got into Sherwood Forest, I don't think, at that time. All those places are very close together. And I thought, when I was writing the story, there's no need for any rivalry, because Robin Hood could easily be in both Yorkshire and Nottinghamshire, no problem at all.
Right. I agree. That seems totally normal and appropriate to me as well.
Yeah.
And I like that, you know, we don't need to pick sides too much, even if you have them sort of based in a particular place. He can still pop down to Sherwood or Nottingham. In fact, actually in your book, you end up a little bit segregating things a little bit, in terms of like Barnesdale is where Marian sort of sets up her home, her sort of base camp in her role as the forest wife, while Robin is poaching deer in Sherwood and thumbing his nose at the sheriff. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that idea of the role of the forest wife that gives the trilogy its name. How did that come to you? What was it you wanted to evoke with that name and that sort of occupation and role in life that it becomes?
I mean, I don't know of any either legend or history of someone who was the forest wife, but I just felt that it would be a kind of a useful role, really, that somebody could sort of set up camp in the forest or the wasteland, that there would be lots of people who would need help, and to have somebody there who was a bit of a healer, a practical person, to some degree a psychologist, because that aspect does come into it too. Sometimes people come with just sort of desperation and needing someone to talk to properly. So these are kind of more modern, more modern aspects of things that I like and have put into the story. And so also someone who, at the beginning of the story too, I mean, it's this person who is the forest wife. It's a role, really. So they actually, it's not giving too much away, I don't think, because Marian and her nurse have to decide to run away into the forest. And they go to see this woman who is the forest wife. Marian is very afraid to go there, but she's desperate and needs some sort of support and help. Her nurse is much more confident. Her nurse is worldly wise.
Right.
And
she was a great character, by the way. Agnes was perhaps one of my absolute favorites in the book.
Good. That's great. So they end up at this hut. It's sort of like a kind of, the forest wife lives in a hut in the middle of the forest. She's a herbalist. She has something of a reputation as a witch, which she, Agnes says, that's not a bad thing, because people only go there if they're desperate. You've got to be desperate to see the forest wife. Marian is very much afraid of the witch-like reputation at first, but when they get there, they find that the forest wife has died. So there is no forest wife. So who is going to take her place? Somebody needs to take her place. Agnes is the first forest wife, not Marian.
Right.
So the story develops, and the role has to be fulfilled, and it's someone who can have some sort of healing knowledge, but it's very basic healing knowledge that depends on plants and herbs and just basic common sense.
And a lot of midwifery. That theme comes back again and again, which also feels like it ties into the sort of cyclical theme, as is expressed with the May Day games in a very physical, visual way that the characters are expressing the cyclical nature of life, and then the way that new births and deaths occur throughout the book, and people transition into new roles. That was really kind of my takeaway more than anything else from the book in regards to plot or anything, was the notion of conveying that sense of how cyclical life can be and how important it is to embrace that and accept it.
Yes, that I felt that was important. And I grow herbs myself. I'm interested in herbalism, but I'm no expert. I have to look up remedies in books.
If you had to live in the forest and your life depended on it, I'm sure you'd get quite good at it.
Absolutely.
That was basically Marian's situation in the book. She didn't start out especially knowledgeable either, but really had to develop that skill and that knowledge base out of practical necessity.
herbalism seems to creep into a lot of my stories, other stories too. I moved on to the Anglo-Saxons after this, but I have a herb wife. My main character there is a herb wife. So again, I'm having to look up remedies and things and hope that I'm putting stuff in that people won't actually try to use.
Oh, I did want to touch just briefly again on that topic of death and the nature of life that comes through. One of the things that I found very unique and interestingly mature about your writing is how there are multiple times when characters die, and I won't spoil anything by saying which characters, but there are characters who die, and it is handled in a very matter-of-fact sort of way, often off screen, as it were, off the page. Other characters will come into a place and just find out that somebody has died, or there'll be a jump forward in time because the book, as is helpful with something that wants to explore cycles of time, moves forward through time, and characters grow up and characters die, and sometimes things are just stated very matter of fact. Oh, in these intervening years, somebody has passed on. And it felt like there was a certain amount of authorial restraint there that I admired, because I feel we are very conditioned to expect characters, especially characters that we might be attached to, who have gotten, names and screen time, to have death scenes, to have a moment we're meant to reflect on, and where they get, their last words in. But there was something that felt very real about the notion of, oh, you have discovered that a person has passed on, and this was not something that was highlighted. It was just very matter of fact. And so I was wondering what sort of inspired that approach to your writing and presentation of death.
I mean, I think the main reason for that is that I thought death would have to be common and normal at that time, and also in the situation that I'm describing, where people are living in a very harsh existence. And so people would have had to adapt to this, and would actually have to accept death in a way that perhaps we don't find so easy or acceptable now. The books were originally produced and published as young adult books, and I did have a few critical reviews from parents whose children had read, teenagers who'd read my books and were distressed when characters that they'd become involved with died. I felt that it is part of life and death, and that sometimes reading about those things kind of helps you learn to deal with it. I think there's a little in the last part, The Path of the She-Wolf, there's a little suggestion of a kind of, again, it's a cyclical thing, that maybe death isn't the end of everything. Just a hint of that, and that things that people have done, left behind, still carry on with the people that they knew, that knew them well, and
that their death can happen in a very sudden, unexpected way, but it's what the impact that they had left on people during their lives that matters, not how they died.
Yes. Yes, and that sudden death could happen at that time, particularly with the forest laws. The forest laws were very harsh, and people were, if you were caught breaking the forest laws, um, men would be imprisoned. They were maimed. They had, you could have your hand cut off, you could have fingers removed, that could lead to you bleeding to death. The other part of that I found really gave me a very different picture was that I read that if a man was arrested, had broken the forest laws, and he was caught, he would be jailed, but his wife and family would be turned out of their home.
Mm-hmm.
So that again gave me much more of a picture of a woman and children made homeless. Where would they go? How would they survive? Only with the help of someone like the forest wife.
Yeah.
Or the forest nuns. And it was a sort of, I have a big belief in community, really, and that in harshest situations, saving things sometimes often is community. It's people getting together to help each other. And so I wanted to bring that into the stories too.
One of my favorite aspects is how Marian, in that role as the forest wife, becomes a legendary figure too. Even in a lot of the other stories where Marian might have a very active role, in that active role, she tends to be like, well, then she's like one of the merry men. Here, she's not one of the merry men. She's got her own thing going on, and she becomes this forest wife. She gets called the Witch of Barnesdale multiple times, and is kind of on that same sort of level as Robin Hood, or the hooded one, or the hooded man, as he's called in your book, where they have this sort of legendary status for the people in Nottinghamshire and Yorkshire who, depending on who they are, might fear them, hate them, love them, benefit from their largesse, hate them because they're thumbing their nose at the authorities, at King John and so on, but that they both had a legendary quality to them. And it feels very appropriate that with Marian having her own kind of legendary status in your world, she has her own sort of band around her, not merry men as much as, merry people. There's some men, some women, mostly women. And that gave you the ability to introduce a lot of really new and unique characters, and to kind of focus on that cast instead of the ones that we're more familiar with.
Yes, I kind of thought that she should have some, as Robin has John, she should have somebody. And it's Philippa. Philippa is the female kind of person who can always be relied on, be at your side, be ready to do things, be brave, and also to say how things are, to be direct.
Right. Would you say that Philippa is at least amongst your favorites of the characters that you got to invent?
Yes, I think she is. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. She came across quite strongly. I like Philippa a lot as well.
Yeah.
Very bold and forthright character who is introduced in an interesting way. She has gotten in trouble with the law, but her husband hasn't. This is a person who is still a wife, still a mother, has multiple children, but isn't being a quiet housewife, is going out and making a ruckus and standing up for people and trying to do the thing that is right, even if it means getting in trouble herself. Very reminiscent of the one character you were alluding to earlier from the Prince of Thieves movie, Fanny, Little John's wife in that version, who's not going to just sit by the sidelines, not just going to stay at home and take care of the children, is going to go out and be active when the time calls for it.
That's right.
I think we've covered a lot of the things I wanted to cover. I did notice in the your previous interview with Allen Wright, you mentioned that your son got very much into bow making following his affection for Prince of Thieves as he was growing up. Is that a thing that he's continued doing?
He now has children, and so this is all passed on to the next generation. We've had to have holiday visits to Sherwood Forest, and we have Robin Hood costumes. But yes, it's being passed down to the next generation.
Just as things were very cyclical in the book, they're ending up being very cyclical in real life. That's wonderful.
Absolutely, yeah.
So speaking of the book, it had been out of print for a little while or hard to get, but has just been reprinted this year, all 3 books in a single volume, which is how I found it and read it. I ordered a brand new copy off of Amazon. Is that the best place to find the book?
Yes, I think it is. I mean, it was originally the Forest Drive trilogy was a corgi book that got put out of print, and I think it had been out of print for about 15 years, something like that. And I just felt very sad about that. Also, that every now and again I've had some kind of film interest that has never come to anything. And it seemed so. I mean, I've had to sort of send away my few copies to people who were showing interest. So I felt that the stories never quite died. And I still, and even through that sort of blank period, I would get messages from some young person who'd read it and enjoyed it, and some very touching, cheering things. So in fact, I got the rights back, and I've published it myself now. And my daughter did the cover design.
I love the cover design.
Yes, I'm very pleased with it, and it was lovely to be. She's a surface pattern designer, and I knew that she would be able to do something, and it was lovely to be able to sort of discuss it with her. And I mean, she was very patient with me and did about 5 or 6 different versions, fiddling about with it and changing things around. But I'm very, very happy with the cover design. So it was a bit of a risk for me, but I'm very pleased that it's up there now, and it's available as an ebook or a paperback. I'm just happy to have it available again.
Yeah. It feels like a very relevant time for it to be coming out. I've noticed that I think especially over the past couple of years, and with how hard and challenging things have been politically and with the pandemic, the Robin Hood stories are ones that people have been finding a lot of comfort in. That's something I've been coming across again and again. It was sort of a theme that I ended up encountering that I wasn't even really expecting to. And so having, this book be available again right now feels very relevant. It also feels like a very good time for Maid Marian to be a central and focal character right now here in the United States. Women's rights and autonomy are under attack. And so having fiction where a character like Maid Marian, who is so built around the idea of bodily autonomy and women's rights, and has, compelling relationships with Robin Hood without ever doing anything like marrying. She is very free, very independent, and surrounds herself with these other independent women who all support each other. That feels like a wonderful time. It's always been a wonderful time, but it feels very present right now.
That's great.
And I've also been just sort of charmed that it happens to be the 200th anniversary of Thomas Love Peacock's novel, Maid Marian. Which was one of the very first historical novels, was centered on Maid Marian. And so wonderful time for Maid Marian centric content to be coming out. Well, is there anything else you'd like to share about your work, the thoughts that went into making it, or the sort of feedback that you've gotten from it? Any other sort of last thoughts?
I think sometimes people have said you could do another one. You know, there would be a way of doing more sequels, but I feel myself that it's a complete thing that I've done, really, and so I don't feel as though I could take it on to develop it and this theme any further. But as I say, I have the theme of a herb wife is very much there in my Anglo-Saxon stories now, and maybe as I'm getting older, my Anglo-Saxon herb wife is much older, and I think I'm enjoying writing about an older herb wife who still has actually something in common with Marian. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's wonderful. And I will definitely include a link to your website in the show description as well.
Thank
so
you.
People can find your other books there.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. That's all a great help.
I hope so. I hope you have a lot of success with those. I hope that the sales for this book do well. And I hope that you and your children and your grandchildren have a great deal of fun continuing to play Robin Hood and tell Robin Hood related and Maid Marian related stories.
I'm sure we will. Thank you for your interest.
Thank you so much. I hope you have a wonderful evening.
Thanks.
All right. Cheers.
Bye.
My thanks again to Theresa Tomlinson for taking her time to talk to me, and for her patience regarding how long it took me to get this episode out. Into the Greenwood is produced and edited by me, Thaddeus Papke. Our theme music is by Plastic 3, and it's brought to you by the generous support of our patrons on patreon.com/intogreenwood. If you'd like to support this independent podcast, you can do so for as little as $1 an episode by going to patreon.com/intogreenwood, where you can find backer-exclusive content such as bonus audio and an exclusive Into the Greenwood t-shirt. If you're feeling uncertain about recurring financial support, but you're enjoying the podcast and would be willing to offer a bit of a tip, we do now have an account at buymeacoffee.com/intogreenwood. Every little bit makes a tremendous difference towards keeping us going, and all money goes directly to paying for the hosting fees and production costs. Except for 10% that we set aside for our select charity of Trees, Water, and People, a top-rated foundation that implements sustainable solutions for providing clean water and food to impoverished communities around the world. If you have not alms with which to support this small podcast, you would also be doing us an immense help by leaving positive ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever it is you listen to us. Into the Greenwood is really lacking in reviews still, which means that Podfinder algorithms won't recommend us to potential new listeners. And of course, recommending the podcast yourself to others would mean a lot as well. Into the Greenwood is completely independent and ad-free, but we do need some assistance to stay that way. If you'd like to get in touch, you can email intogreenwood@gmail.com. And while I've been on a bit of a social media break lately, the accounts are still active for Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, all with the handle @IntoGreenwood. We're also on Discord now, in a server set up by friend of the show Mike Nichols, where our merry band has discussions, shares artwork, organizes watch parties, and even has a Robin Hood-themed book club. If you'd like to join, just get in touch and we'll get you an invitation. That's all for now, though. So once again, I find myself wishing safe travels to you, one and all, until our next journey together into the Greenwood. We're also on Discord now, in a server set up by friend of the show Mike Nichols, where our merry band has discussions, shares artwork, organizes watch parties, and even have a Robin Hood themed book club. We're about to have our first... We're also on Discord now. If you'd like to get in touch, you can email indogreenwood@gmail.com. And while I've been on a bit of a social media break lately, the accounts are still active for Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, all with the handle @indogreenwood. We're also on Discord now, in a server set up by friend of the show Mike Nichols, where our merry band has discussions, shares artwork, organizes watch parties, and even has a Robin Hood themed book club. If you'd like to join, just get in touch and we'll get you an invitation. That's all for now, though. So once again, I find myself wishing safe travels to you, one and all, until our next journey together into the Greenwood.